and see people thumbing through newspapers. Office drones, students, rickshaw pullers. It's a wonderful sight. In 2012, Ken Auletta wrote in The New Yorker that, quote, "India is one of the few places on earth where newspapers still thrive." A dozen years later, that's still very true. The daily circulation of newspapers has doubled since 2012. The Trade Association WARC estimates that about half of urban India reads a newspaper every day. There are also hundreds of TV news channels, many of them highly influential and highly partisan. Cheap to produce shouting matches dominate, like they do here. Republic TV, something akin to India's Fox News, is unapologetically pro-government, and that used to set it apart. No longer. Both TV and newspapers derive a huge share of their advertising income from the government, especially since the pandemic, when other ad buyers withdrew. NDTV, the last bastion of independent TV news, was acquired by one of the world's richest men, energy tycoon Gautam Adani, seen here in Ahmedabad. The fortunes of Mr. Adani have risen alongside Mr. Modi's. Adani won NDTV in a hostile takeover bid in 2022, and since then, many of the network's longtime anchors and executives have stepped down. But increasingly, the biggest scoops, the gutsiest investigations, and the best watchdog reporting are appearing not in newspapers or TV, but in the digital pages of scrappy online news startups. Much of this work is supported by grants and reader subscriptions and donations, and the journalists doing this work are particularly targeted by the government and its supporters. Back in 2012, internet use was limited. Now, roughly half of this country of 1.4 billion is online, according to the Reuters Institute at Oxford. Indians use more smartphone data than the US and China combined. The media landscape online is exploding as a result. Again, according to Reuters, more than half of respondents said they got their news on YouTube and WhatsApp. It's a bit of a problem because WhatsApp and other digital communication platforms are very efficient at feeding misinformation, whipping up nationalist fervor, and organizing hate. There has been such a high incidence of violence attributed to India's most popular chat platform that researchers coined the term, quote, WhatsApp lynchings. This picture by my friend, the late photographer Danish Siddiqui of Reuters, shows a group of Hindu men beating a Muslim man during sectarian violence in Delhi in 2020. This is a riot that broke out over the Citizenship Act that was spoken about this morning. I alluded at the beginning of this talk to what good journalism is up against in India, and part of it is this: misinformation that bombards Indians through apps on their phones. Also, the Modi government uses its heft as a large ad buyer to muzzle the mainstream press. And it uses legal warfare to discredit, censor, and silence the journalists who dare to present a reality that is contrary to the one the BJP and its supporters have invested so much to project. Mr. Modi's PR machine is a thing to behold. The Prime Minister has become larger than life, standing tall in towering billboards across the capital, speaking in weekly radio addresses, and traveling around the country for ceremonial groundbreakings on projects that concretize a Hindu nationalist vision. His governance style is constant campaign mode. Modi's image is ubiquitous, but also carefully curated. The state-run and other co-opted media often depict Mr. Modi standing alone, a sober, almost ethereal, godlike figure. And to his supporters, criticism of him or his government's policies, which his party conflates into being one and the same, has become a kind of blasphemy. The untold sums the government and the BJP and its supporters are spending on publicity appear to be a very sound investment, because more and more of the country is falling in line. Recent evidence of this is the inauguration of the Ram Temple in Ayodhya. Again, this is a Hindu temple that was built on the rubble of a 450-year-old mosque that was torn down by Hindu nationalist activists in 1992. It was an act of terrorism that left 2,000 dead. a dark day for India. Not so in the new India of Mr. Modi and his supporters, whose revisionist take on history is literally taking form brick by brick. Seizing the site and building a temple to the Hindu god Ram, who Hindus believe was born in Ayodhya, has been a cornerstone of the Hindu nationalist project for decades. But what seemed an outrageous and fringe idea in the 1990s has become a pillar of a popular prime minister's re-election campaign this year. The temple's inauguration in January had all the pomp and circumstance of a national holiday. Even the Delhi government, which is run by the opposition Aap Party, jumped on the bandwagon, ordering a half day at school so that teachers could watch the prime minister at the partially built temple in wall-to-wall cable TV news coverage. My colleagues Mujib Mashal and Hari Kumar were there in Ayodhya, and they reported, quote, "As a show of laser lights and bone-jarring beats went on in the background, about a dozen national television channels tried to outdo each other in what for most has become a guiding mission, to shine a favorable spotlight on the Prime Minister's every move." So deeply enthralled is the popular press to Mr. Modi that the government's setbacks, from Chinese troop incursions across India's border to an economy that has failed to produce enough jobs for young people, especially women, to an ethnic conflict brewing in the Northeast, receive on the whole far less attention. This is a picture of Indian soldiers in eastern Ladakh, a region high in the Himalaya, where 20 Indian soldiers were killed in a clash with Chinese troops in 2020. In the recent interview with the FT, Mr. Modi spoke about the work of changing perceptions. He was addressing a question about corruption, but I think we can read his answer more broadly. He said, quote, "It's important to recognize that India wouldn't have achieved the status of the world's fastest growing economy if the issues you've highlighted were as pervasive as suggested. Often," he said, "these concerns stem from perceptions, and altering perceptions sometimes takes time." Altering public perceptions for the Modi government has involved more than just projecting the Prime Minister's image everywhere. It has also involved punishing critics who question his dogma. Indian journalists have endured raids, harassment, arrests, and imprisonment. The government has spied on them using Pegasus, and it has charged them with the highest crimes in India, offending religious sentiment, sedition, and even terrorism, simply for toiling away as reporters. Thousands of people have been detained in India under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, including poets, political organizers, and even an elderly Catholic priest with Parkinson's disease who died in custody. The UAPA has also been used against journalists. There are 13 journalists currently who are being tried or investigated, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. One of them is Siddique Kappan, a reporter from Kerala who was arrested on his way to the scene of an alleged gang rape of a teenage Dalit girl in the state of Uttar Pradesh. The girl later died of her injuries. Mr. Kappan was traveling to the city of Hathras when he was stopped at a toll plaza. He and his taxi driver were taken into custody by the Uttar Pradesh police. The top official in Uttar Pradesh, for those who don't know, is a Hindu priest and powerful BJP leader. For merely intending to report on the gruesome sexual assault of a Dalit girl by Hindu men, Mr. Kappan was charged with sedition, promoting enmity among religious groups, and UAPA. Here he is 2.5 years later, with his family after he was released from prison. Unsatisfied, apparently, with the criminal law procedures the government has at its disposal to threaten, intimidate, and silence journalists, the government has introduced rules to better harness what's published online. The so-called IT rules have created a government fact-checking unit whose purpose is to identify, quote-unquote, fake, false, or misleading information concerning the government. Once identified, the platforms hosting this information are ordered to edit or take it down. This happened recently with the noted investigative magazine The Caravan, which was forced to take down a story in which the Indian Army was accused of torturing 3 men who died in custody in Kashmir. The government has also weaponized its tax authorities to go after journalists, think tanks, and advocacy groups who represent a threat in some fashion to the narrative that Mr. Modi and his supporters want conveyed about India. The targets have ranged from Amnesty International to Greenpeace to India's Center for Policy Research, a premier think tank in Delhi. In a testament to the independence of online news organizations and the threat that independence poses to the government, reporters and editors have had their privacy invaded in myriad ways. Last October, the police in New Delhi, the law enforcement arm of the central government, raided the homes and offices of journalists who worked for a left-leaning portal called NewsClick. Several journalists were arrested and their laptops, phones, and cameras were seized. It was the newsroom's second government raid in 2 years. The first was done by financial authorities in 2021. Here you'll see authorities carrying out seized items from the raid. And around this time last year, tax authorities raided the offices of the BBC, just a few weeks after the release of a documentary that took a critical look at Mr. Modi's role in the deadly Gujarat riots of 2002, when he was the state's chief minister. The government also used the occasion to flex its new IT rules, forcing YouTube and Twitter, now X, to take down links to the documentary. I mentioned earlier that Hindu nationalists have used social media channels to organize hate, distrust, and even violence against Muslims, and I want to speak more about that now. Professor Varshni, who we were fortunate to hear speak earlier today, has argued eloquently that India is in the process of creating its own Jim Crow system, with Muslims denigrated into second-class citizens. The Ram Temple is a consecration of this new Hindu supremacist order, Mr. Varshni and others argue. It is clear that among the journalists facing persecution by the Modi government and his allies, Muslim journalists are most directly in the crosshairs, and I will give you just a few examples of that. Of the 13 journalists I mentioned who are facing charges under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, 9 are Muslim. In Kashmir, India's only Muslim-majority region, the entire population was plunged into a communications blackout in 2019, as lawmakers in Delhi, led by the BJP, voted to take away the region's statehood and right to self-governance. Before and since, Kashmiri reporters routinely spoke about being brought in for interrogations and jailed. The Kashmir Press Club, seen here, was forcibly taken over and shut down in 2022. Across India, Muslim women journalists have found themselves listed for sale on an auctions app. I won't give the name of the app here because it includes a vulgar, derogatory term for a Muslim woman combined with a Hindi word for female servant. The more than 20 women whose personal information was shared in this fake auction had all reported critically on how the Modi government's policies had impacted religious minorities. They were mostly women in their early 20s, working for the hard-hitting new online journalism outlets that have proven so difficult to muzzle or control. Finally, I'm going to speak a bit about my experience as a journalist in India, which was a great privilege. First for the Associated Press and then the New York Times, I enjoyed many rights that my Indian colleagues at local news outlets do not. But the climate in India has become so antagonistic toward the free press that even those of us in the Foreign Press Corps found ourselves the targets of harassment and sometimes far worse. A French journalist, Vanessa Dugnac, who had been living in and reporting from India for decades, had to leave the country recently after the government told her that she could have her visa withdrawn or face harsher penalties for practicing journalism. An internal survey that I and others conducted over 3 years at the Foreign Correspondents Club of South Asia found that 1 of every 2 foreign correspondents is summoned by the Modi government to explain their reporting. I was summoned at least twice a year. A badge of honor? Usually the summons came disguised as a friendly invitation to tea. But just as soon as the tea had been poured, one minister or another would start berating us. One time, I remember the Minister of Information going to the trouble of printing the last 15 or 20 of my and other correspondents' articles, He then read headlines aloud, seemingly at random, with some sarcasm in his tone. It almost wasn't worth the tea. Beyond the reprimands, the government punishes those whose stories it doesn't like with short-term visas that make renting an apartment or even buying a cell phone service all but impossible. Nearly a third of the subcontinent is now off limits to foreign journalists without a special permit, a permit that almost never comes. No journalist has been permitted to report from Kashmir since the drastic political changes of 2019. Despite all that I've spoken about today, I want to end with optimism. Young Indians, especially young women, are clamoring to get into journalism. The universe of journalism schools is growing constantly in India, and Indians comprise the largest share of foreign students at many journalism schools in the US, including my alma mater, Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Even with the long hours and terrible pay in most Indian newsrooms. Even with the high barriers to entry in Western news organizations, where old hierarchies are proving slow to dismantle.